there is a portrait of the Viking that has survived for over 1,000 years. Blonde-haired, blue-eyed, a seafaring warrior from the fjords of Scandinavia, raiding the coasts of Europe under a banner of Norse blood and Norse blood alone. For generations, that picture seemed settled. Then the DNA arrived. Calligrapher. And the DNA did not simply confirm the legend. It complicated it quietly, persistently, and in ways that researchers are still working to understand. Because when scientists opened the genomes of Viking-age skeletons pulled from burial mounds across Scandinavia, the British Isles, and beyond, they did not find a single unified bloodline marching out from the north. They found something stranger, something far more layered, a population whose identity, and it turns out, was never as pure or as simple as the word Viking implies. This is not a story about debunking the Vikings. It is a story about discovering who they actually were, and how the evidence buried in their bones is now rewriting one of the most iconic chapters in European history. For centuries, the Viking story was told the same way. Beginning around the late 8th century, seafarers from what is now Norway, Denmark, and Sweden launched raids, trade expeditions, and eventual settlements across Britain, Wales, Ireland, France, and even into the Mediterranean and North America. Historians built this narrative from a combination of sources, Norse sagas written centuries after the events they described. Their monastic chronicles recorded by the very communities the Vikings raided, and archaeological finds of long ships, weapons, and burial goods. The picture that it emerged was one of a relatively homogeneous Scandinavian population expanding outward. Viking became shorthand not just for an activity raiding, trading, settling, but for an ethnicity, a people defined by ancestry as much as by behavior. It made sense. The artifacts looked Scandinavian. The language of the raiders was Old Norse. The ships were built in the north. Why would the people themselves be anything other than what the culture suggested? Else. But even before genetics entered the picture, there were small inconsistencies. Burial sites in places like Scotland's Orkney Islands contained individuals dressed and buried in distinctly Norse fashion, yet some of these burials sat alongside earlier local traditions. That's suggesting blending rather than replacement. In Ireland, Viking-founded towns like Dublin showed material culture that was part Norse. Part something else entirely, a fusion that didn't fit a story of simple colonization by an unchanged outside group. And then there was the question of women. Norse sagas focused overwhelmingly on male warriors and male lineages. Yet some burial sites containing Scandinavian-style grave goods belong to women, and isotope analysis on certain skeletons suggested individuals had grown up eating diets inconsistent with a Scandinavian childhood. Something about the population on the move did not match the population imagined in the stories. These were small cracks, easy to explain away individually, but they were the kind of cracks that eventually genetics would not be able to ignore. The real shift began when researchers started sequencing ancient DNA from Viking-age burials at scale, not just one or two skeletons, but hundreds. Spanning Scandinavia and the regions Vikings are known to have reached. Ancient DNA works differently from the DNA tests people are familiar with today. Researchers can extract genetic material preserved in bone, particularly from the dense petrous portion of the skull, and red fragments of the genome that have survived for over 1,000 years. From this, they can reconstruct ancestry, where a person's genetic lineage traces back to, and how it compares to other ancient and modern populations. Two other tools matter here too. mitochondrial DNA passed down only through the maternal line, and Y chromosome DNA passed down only through the paternal line. Comparing these two streams can reveal something sagas never could: whether the men and women in a population came from the same place or different ones entirely. When researchers applied these tools to Viking Age remains, they expected reasonably to find a relatively unified Scandinavian genetic signature, perhaps with some expected mixing in colonized regions like Britain and Ireland. That was not exactly what they found. If stories like this interest you, consider subscribing, because there is far more hidden in the human past than most of us realize. What the genomes revealed instead was a Scandinavia that was, even before the Viking Age began, already a patchwork. Researchers identified distinct genetic clusters within what we call Vikings groups from what is now Norway. Denmark and Sweden carried meaningfully different ancestry profiles from one another, despite sharing a broad cultural identity, language, and seafaring tradition. That was not a contradiction. It was a signal. So it meant the Viking world was never one population expanding outward. It was several related but distinct populations, each shaped by their own local histories, who came to share a culture, raiding, trading, shipbuilding, religion without sharing a single bloodline. And then came the part that genuinely surprised researchers studying Viking Age burial sites in the British Isles and elsewhere, some skeletons buried with full Viking ceremonial trappings weapons, bell roaches. The unmistakable material signature of Norse identity carried little to no Scandinavian ancestry at all. Their genomes pointed instead toward local British or Irish populations, or in some cases, toward ancestry from regions further south and east than expected. The story did not collapse, it widened, because what this suggested was something the sagas never recorded: that being a Viking was not strictly about where your ancestors came from. It was, at least in part, about what you did, who you fought alongside, and what identity you adopted. Local populations were not just being raided or replaced in some cases, they were being absorbed into Viking identity itself. Naturally, genetically distinct, but culturally indistinguishable. At this point, researchers found themselves weighing several possible explanations for the picture emerging from the data. In one framework centers on internal diversity, the idea that Scandinavia itself was never genetically uniform before the Viking Age even began, shaped by older migrations and regional isolation across Norway, Denmark, and Sweden's varied geography of fjords, forests, and islands. A second framework involves cultural absorption without full genetic replacement, the idea that Viking identity functioned more like a social and economic role than an ethnic one, allowing outsiders to be integrated into raiding crews, trading networks, and settlements. And a third framework points toward earlier and more extensive contact between Scandinavia and the rest of Europe than previously assumed, meaning some of the foreign ancestry detected wasn't necessarily new from the Viking Age itself, but a deeper layer already present that simply became more visible once researchers looked closely. Researchers remain cautious about which of these explanations carries the most weight, and the honest answer, based on current evidence, is likely some combination of all three, varying by region and time period. The most significant turning point came with a large-scale ancient DNA study analyzing hundreds of Viking Age individuals across Scandinavia. The British Isles, Greenland, and other regions touched by Norse expansion, one of the broadest genomic surveys of this period ever conducted. That study mattered because of its scale and its geographic spread, rather than drawing conclusions from isolated burial sites. It allowed researchers to compare ancestry patterns across an entire network of Viking connected locations, tracking how genetic ancestry moved or didn't alongside cultural and material evidence. The key finding was this: genetic ancestry and Viking cultural identity were not the same thing and had never been the same thing throughout the entire period historians call the Viking Age. This is where the story takes its sharpest turn, not just that some individuals buried as Vikings lacked Scandinavian ancestry. The deeper surprise was where some of that non-Scandinavian ancestry pointed toward ancestral connections with populations from Southern Europe and even further afield, signals that did not fit neatly into the expected map of Viking contact at all, not the populations researchers expected, not even in some cases, the regions they expected. The genome was not erasing the Viking story, it was revealing an older, more tangled one, beneath it a Scandinavia, and a Viking world that had been receiving genetic input from distant parts of Europe for far longer than the historical record alone ever suggested. This does not prove a single new origin story. It complicates the old one in a way that may never be fully resolved, and that researchers suggest may be the most accurate reflection of how human populations actually behave. Because what the Viking genome teaches us extends far beyond Scandinavia. And human history is rarely a single line moving from one point to another. It is closer to a delta, countless smaller streams, splitting, merging, disappearing underground, and resurfacing generations later. The Vikings were never a pure population launching outward into history. They were already potential before their famous age even began, a product of older meetings between Northern and Southern Europe, between different waves of ancient migration. Between people who left no names but left their DNA. Picture for a moment a fjord at dawn, mist sitting low over the water, mountains rising sheer and dark on either side. Not the kind of landscape that feels less like a place people pass through and more like a place that shapes everyone who lives there for thousands of years before a single longship was built. People moved along these coastlines by foot, by early boat, intermarrying, trading, settling, layer upon layer, unrecorded, until the genome became the only place those meetings were preserved. When the Viking Age began, it did not begin from nothing. It began from centuries of quiet human movement that left no saga, no chronicle. That's nothing but a signature buried in bone, waiting for a tool advanced enough to read it. So when we ask, who were the Vikings? The honest answer is more complex than the legend, not less remarkable. They were warriors and traders, yes, but they were also the descendants of older unions between peoples the sagas never named. Their identity was cultural, as much as ancestral, open enough in places to absorb outsiders into its fold and call them Vikings too. The old map was too small, not wrong in what it captured: the ships, the raids, the language, the reach, but incomplete in what it left out. The genome did not take the Vikings away from us. In fact, it gave them back to us as something more human, not a single bloodline storming out of the north, but a meeting point of many older stories, ends, written into DNA long before anyone thought to write them down at all. And perhaps that is the real discovery here, not that the Vikings were never what we thought, but that no population ever is. Every people we think we understand completely is beneath the surface, still being written. The map is never finished, the genome is still speaking, structuring, And history, it turns out, has always had more chapters than we knew to look for. If you found this kind of story compelling, let me know in the comments which population's hidden history you'd want uncovered next.